All right, now that you understand the basics of getting started in Photoshop and you're familiar with the workspace and the panels and how all that works, in this section we're going to jump onto layers. And Photoshop is all about layers. All right, so if you think of layers panel, if you go to window then layers, you can see the many different layers, right? So think of it as many different sheets of paper. Whatever's on the top is the only thing you can see if it's covering up the whole workspace or the whole artboard. So it will cover up the layers below it. Now it won't cover it up if it's not, geographically placed on top of it. Like if it's over to the side, you'll be able to see to a lower layer, the layer right below it, right? The second to top layer. And then you can see the third and fourth if they're all just in different spots on the canvas. However, if you adjust the transparency, in other words, how opaque the layer is in the layers panel, then you will be able to see through the top layer, whatever layer you're on, to the layer below it. You can also adjust the layer blending mode, which we'll go over. You can add a layer style. You can also add special effects like lighting and color adjustment using adjustment layers. So if you're changing a blending mode it's basically how a layer blends with the layer below it. So if you change the blending mode on top, say it's a 2-layer Photoshop file, if you change it to say multiply, then it's gonna have a specific effect, or darken, it's gonna have a darkening effect, as opposed to screen or lighten, which will have a lightening effect. So it will blend in a different way. By default, it's just 100% opacity. It's not see-through, and there's no blending effect. You just see the top layer by default. So we'll be going over that in this section. So one thing to consider is whenever you're in Photoshop and you add a filter or you're using the brush tool to brush some paint on, whatever layer you're on is the only one that's affected. That confuses a lot of beginners in Photoshop. They pull the brush tool out and they start painting on, and they notice that it has affected one layer that they were on, but it hasn't affected other layers. Depending on how high up the layer is in hierarchy, depends on how much of it is visible, of course. So look in the layers panel. If it's not up, just go to window then layers, and this will make sense throughout these lectures, but you just want to see which one is highlighted, and that's the active layer that you're going to actually apply an effect to. Now you can resize the image. If you go to image and image size, that's going to affect the whole file regardless. It'll affect all the layers at once. But certain effects, for example filters, and if you're brushing and if you're moving with the move tool, the layer, and you're applying other effects, it's only going to affect the layer that you're on. So just check and see which layer is selected in the layers panel. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started learning about layering images, as well as adjustment layers and layer styles, and more about layers in Photoshop. Open Photoshop and then open the file layered.psd from the support files. I've layered 5 photos here to save some time. Notice that we only see the top layer because unless the opacity or the blending mode is changed from the defaults of 100% and normal, top layers simply cover up layers below them. However, click the eye icon next to each layer to toggle visibility of each layer. Click and drag layers in the layers panel in order to rearrange them. Of course, the top layer will be the one visible by default. Notice that the background layer can't be moved above other layers. One-layer files such as JPEGs have a background layer by default, as do PSD files in which the background layer has not been converted to a normal layer yet. It's a locked layer. To make it a normal layer, just click and drag the lock icon to the trash, or double-click on the layer and name it something and click OK. Now that layer can be moved above other layers like other layers. We can remove pixels from these layers by making a selection with, for example, the marquee selection tool, and then pressing backspace on the PC or delete on the Mac. Make sure you're on the same layer that you want to remove pixels from. Now those pixels are transparent because they have no content on them and show through to the layer below them. This is a very important point. This only affects the layer that we're on in the Layers panel. Click the layer in the Layers panel to highlight it in blue, and then make a selection and delete. We can also add some brush strokes with the brush tool, and that will affect only the layer that we're on. So if we wanted to add some brush strokes on their own layer, we would need to click the Create a New Layer icon on the bottom of the Layers panel, and then Brush. Then we can move it around on its own layer. To delete a layer, select it in the Layers panel and press Backspace or Delete on the keyboard, or click and drag it to the trash. We can also duplicate a layer by clicking and dragging it to the Create a New Layer icon, or by pressing Ctrl-J on the PC or Command-J on the Mac. If we make a selection of an area first, and then press Ctrl-J or Command-J, it will only duplicate that selected area to a new layer. To adjust the opacity or the fill of a layer, adjust the amount in those areas near the top right-hand corner of the Layers panel. We can also lock pixels of a layer, such as transparent pixels, image pixels, or just lock the position of the layer, or lock the entire layer. Sometimes there's a need to group layers for better organization. To group layers, just click the folder icon on the bottom of the Layers panel, or go to Layer, Group Layers. Then click and drag layers into that folder. Another way to organize layers is to assign them colors. On the PC, right-click on a layer in the Layers panel. On a Mac, Control-click the layer. Then click one of the colors to assign that layer to a color. Then up where it says Kind, select Color, and the specific color to only see those layers with that assigned color. Or we can toggle this so we can find only the pixel layers, adjustment layers, type layers, shape layers, or smart objects. Other options including filtering layer by name, layers that have specific effects applied, filtering by layer blending mode, attributes, type of smart object, and layers that have an active selection. Click the red on-off button to toggle the filtering. In the next lecture, we'll adjust layer blending modes for some specific looks. Let's close this file we've been working on and don't save changes. Then reopen layered.psd. By default, layers have a normal layer blending mode, meaning the top layer does not blend at all with lower layers. Now make sure you have the top layer selected, highlighted blue in the Layers panel, and then click on what says Normal, that's the layer blending mode, and select a few different layer blending modes to see the different effects it has. Some more popular ones used in photography include Multiply, which blends layers and makes them look a little darker, Screen, and Lighten, which is a little bit lighter, as well as Overlay. Click the layer blending mode and just press up and down on the keyboard to cycle through the various modes. And we can use this in conjunction with, for example, the opacity and fill as well. If we paint with the brush on a new layer, press the right and left bracket to resize the brush. By default, it covers up the pixels of the lower layers, but if we change the blending mode to color or overlay, it allows us to retain the texture of the lower layer but change the hue. This is one way to add makeup to a model, or how to colorize old black and white photos. So layer blending modes can be pretty useful in certain contexts of colorization or adding texture to a different photo. Next, we'll go over adjustment layers, which are a great way to add effects to an image that can be actively adjusted. Oftentimes, when designers or photographers want to make an adjustment to a photo, they can go to Image, Adjustments, and there's a lot of options here for adjusting curves, levels, brightness and contrast, exposure, as well as adjusting hue, saturation, vibrance, color balance, photo filters, and so on. If we use one of these adjustments right now, it would affect the layer that we're currently on in the Layers panel. However, another way to apply these adjustments is to create an adjustment layer. The benefit in using an adjustment layer is that we can change the settings of the effect even after we apply it. And we can also remove the effect or adjust how strong the effect is by changing its opacity after the fact. I'll show you what I mean. Open layered.psd again and click and drag the beach layer to the top. If I go to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, and adjust the saturation and hue of the layer, the effect is set after I apply it, unless I go to Edit, Undo, or step backward in the History panel. However, if I go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and Hue Saturation, or if I click on the New Adjustment Layer on the bottom of the Layers panel and select Hue Saturation, now we can add the same effect but as an adjustment layer. I can make it more of a subtle effect by lowering the opacity. I can also double click the Hue Saturation adjustment layer and edit it because it stays live. I can also paint some black on this mask right here, the layer mask, so that the effect does not apply to certain areas of the image. There's more on masking later in this course. You can also delete the entire effect by deleting the adjustment layer. Adjustment layers are a better way to add a lot of these effects, and you'll notice if you go to Image Adjustments, a lot of these effects here are also under Layer, New Adjustment Layer. It allows us to create more subtle effects, and also we can adjust the settings even after we've added the effect. Next, we'll go over layer styles, which are a helpful and fun way to add some style to a layer. Layer styles can be useful, or they can just make a layer look kind of cheesy. It all depends on which style we're using and in what way. Open layered.psd and let's resize whichever layer is in the top layer. It doesn't matter which one. By selecting the Move tool, making sure Show Transform Controls is selected up at the top, up in the options bar, and then click and drag on a corner to make it a little smaller so we can see the edge of this layer. Hold Shift to maintain proportion. Then press Enter or Return to apply that resize. Next, go to Layer, Layer Style, and select one of the styles to bring up the Layer Style menu. Alternatively, we can click on the new Layer Style icon on the bottom of the Layers panel. Some of these, such as bevel and emboss, can make your design look kind of corny and not as professional. Oftentimes simpler is better. However, this is an effective way to add a stroke or border to a layer, whether it's inside or outside. Whether it's an inside or outside stroke. Check the checkbox next to a style to apply it, and click the name to adjust its options. We can adjust the size of the stroke here as well as a few other options. There are a lot of other styles to check out here, including inner and drop shadow, inner and outer glow. We can overlay a layer with the color. And adjust its blending mode. And same goes for gradient and pattern. So we can come up with some pretty cool effects. That wraps up this section on layers, including layer blending modes, adjustment layers, and layer styles. In the next section, we'll go over how to make selections in Photoshop and when we would use certain methods to select pixels in order to adjust or edit them.